I woke up one night, and there she was, standing in the corner of my room. Her face looked like my neighbor's, Mama Uduak, but her eyes glowed red, like burning coals. She didn't speak. She just stared. The air smelled rotten, like meat left out too long in the sun. Mama Uduak lived in the mud brick house next to ours. She was always alone, and she rarely spoke to anyone unless she needed something. When she did talk, her voice had an edge that made people uncomfortable. She never smiled, not really. She would sometimes curl her lips, but it looked more like a warning than anything friendly. My mother didn't trust her. "She's bitter," she said. "Jealous of those who have joy. Stay away from her, child. Her heart is dark." I didn't know what Mama meant by that. To me, Mama Uduak was just a strange old woman who liked to sit in the shade of her mango tree, watching everything and everyone. I thought she was harmless, until the night of the goat. My father had bought a fat, white goat to celebrate my older brother's upcoming wedding. It was the biggest goat I'd ever seen. We tied it up in the yard, and every evening, I'd feed it fresh leaves. One evening, as I was feeding the goat, I felt eyes on me. When I looked up, I saw Mama Uduak standing by the fence, watching me. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes were sharp, like she was carving something out of the air between us. "Good evening, Mama Uduak," I said, trying to be polite. She didn't reply. Instead, she muttered something under her breath. I couldn't hear the words, but they made my skin crawl. I hurried back into the house. That night, I woke up to the sound of screaming. At first, I thought it was a person crying out in pain, but then I realized it was the goat. The sound was high-pitched and terrible, like it was being torn apart. My father and I ran outside with a lantern, but when we got to the yard, the goat was gone. All that was left was a trail of blood leading into the bushes. We searched for hours, but we never found it. My father said it must have been a wild animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The way Mama Uduak had stared at me earlier that day stayed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had something to do with it. The next morning, Mama Uduak walked past our house. She was humming to herself, and her lips were stained red, like she'd been eating berries. But no berries grew in our village. After that, strange things started happening. I began waking up at night to the sound of footsteps in my room. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But one night, I opened my eyes and saw a shadow moving on the wall. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was too tall, and it moved like smoke. When I turned on the lamp, the shadow disappeared. The next day, my mother fell ill. She couldn't get out of bed, and her skin turned pale. She barely had the strength to speak. We called the village healer, who gave her herbs and said she needed rest. But no matter what we did, she didn't get better. That's when I remembered what my mother had said about Mama Uduak. She's jealous of those who have joy. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was this her doing? Was she trying to take away our happiness because of her own bitterness? I told my father what I thought, but he didn't believe me. "You're letting your imagination run wild," he said. "Mama Uduak is just an old woman. She can't hurt us." But I knew better. That night, I stayed awake, waiting for the shadow to come back. Sure enough, just after midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to sleep, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I opened my eyes just a crack and saw her shadow again. It was standing at the foot of my bed, tall and thin and wrong. It stretched across the ceiling, and its edges flickered like flames. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. Then the shadow moved toward the door and slipped out into the hallway. I followed it, my feet moving before I could think. The shadow led me to the doorway of my mother's room. It stopped there, shifting and twisting in the dim light. I saw my mother lying on the bed, her chest rising and falling weakly. The shadow reached out toward her, and I felt a cold wind pass through me. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran to the oldest man in the village, Baba Ekanam. He was known for his wisdom and knowledge of the old ways. When I told him what I had seen, he nodded gravely. Mama Uduak's jealousy has poisoned her heart, he said. She is no longer just a woman. She has turned herself into something unnatural. She feeds on the happiness of others to fill the emptiness inside her. How can we stop her? I asked, desperate. Baba Ekanam handed me a small pouch of black powder. Sprinkle this across your doorway, he said. It will keep her from entering your home. But be warned, this will only stop her for a while. To truly break her power, you must confront her and force her to leave the village. That night, I did as Baba Ekanam told me. I sprinkled the black powder across every doorway and window in our house. Then I waited. Just after midnight, I heard the footsteps again. They were slower this time, as if the shadow was hesitant. I stayed in the living room, clutching a lantern, and watched as the shadow appeared outside the front door. It pressed against the doorway, but it couldn't cross the line of black powder. I could hear it whispering, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Then it laughed, a low, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. The next morning, Mama Uduak's house was empty. No one saw her leave, and no one dared to ask where she'd gone. My mother's health began to improve, and the strange noises stopped. For a while, it seemed like everything was back to normal. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps in the dark. And I wonder if she's really gone, or if she's just waiting for her chance to come back.